I welcome you to the Top 10 channel. Subscribe to the channel, put a like, and we start the next top. 10 horror houses that really existed. With the Turpin case in early 2018, the media revived the term horror house, which has been used to characterize any home where horrific events have occurred throughout the years. Kidnappings, rapes, and rotting corpses. The horrors resembled the worst of Hollywood horror films. Some feel that society is to blame for these events, claiming that neighbors, visitors, social workers, and the police should have seen the signs and intervened sooner. Was it true that no one knew there was a problem, or that no one wanted to get involved? Are these incidents solely criminal, or are they also a failing of our mental health system? These types of inquiries are being asked more frequently each time a new horror house is discovered. Here are some examples of things that defy explanation. The Turpin House, U.S. The Turpins had 13 children in chains all over the house in Paris, California. They were malnourished and were beaten in the filthy, gloomy structure. One of the girls was able to sneak through a window and reveal the situation in January 2018. For more than 2 years, she had been planning her escape. The children were imprisoned for weeks or even months at a period, were only allowed to shower once a year, and were denied any form of amusement. Only journals were allowed for them to write in. The torment was not only physical, but also psychological. Food, including pies, would be purchased and left on the table or counter by the pair. The youngsters, on the other hand, were not allowed to eat the meal. Medication and dental care were unfamiliar to the children. The couple's unsettling Facebook profile featured Shining-style family photos and a phony Elvis for a pretend wedding. The children, aged 2 to 29, were so malnourished that they appeared to be years younger. They didn't attend school. The father of the Turpin children ran a totally legitimate homeschool for his children. Horror. (9) The small house that smelled of corpses, Japan. Police discovered 9 bodies in a residence in Tokyo's suburbs in late 2017. Mutilated, headless remains were arranged in cardboard crates. The 27-year-old suspected murderer was using an arguably efficient tactic to disguise the smell. He had covered the bodies with kitty litter. The scent had been bothering the neighbors, but they assumed it was coming from the sewers. Investigators linked a 23-year-old woman's disappearance to the house's occupant when investigating her disappearance. The missing woman had reached out to the man through social media while looking for someone to join her in a suicide pact. Security cameras around train stations near the horrific apartment caught the two. In Japan, the death penalty is still used. Because the Japanese do not use the guillotine, if this individual is convicted of several murders and put to death, he will not get the same treatment as his victims. The death punishment in their country is carried out via hanging. Jitsuriyas, kidnapper, Italy. When kidnapping a young woman, it is not a good idea to take a car ride with the child that was born after the mother was raped and who appears to be unwell enough for the cops to notice. Aloisio Francesco Rosario Giordano, a 52-year-old Italian guy from Jitsuria, experienced exactly this. For 10 years, he had been sequestering a 29-year-old Romanian woman, with whom he had 2 children. The unfortunate woman was forced to live in a mouse and roach-infested basement closet with no running water, power, or access to a restroom. In 1995, Giordano had already been jailed for comparable facts. Initially, the Romanian woman, who was 19 at the time, was employed as a caregiver for the man's ailing wife. He only confined the poor caregiver in the cellar after his wife died. She was raped, tortured, and beaten repeatedly. Giordano would treat the most critical wounds personally, albeit in a basic manner due to his lack of medical training. The 2 youngsters were forced to witness their mother's maltreatment. They were even forced to participate at times if they didn't want to be beaten. Anthony Sowell and the rotten corpses, U.S. The smell is the most significant issue when murdering somebody in your own home. After some time, Cleveland investigators decided to pay attention to persistent complaints from residents of a backstreet who couldn't figure out why their neighborhood was stinking so bad. Anthony Sowell's house was finally raided by law officials in 2009. Sowell was a former soldier who had turned into a serial killer. In 1989, he was found guilty of rape and condemned to prison, but he was released in 2005. He had apparently learned from his previous mistakes and decided to strangle every new victim after wrapping them. The bodies would then be buried in his garden or dismembered. In the case of one of the victims, authorities discovered only her head in the residence. Neighbors had witnessed a naked woman fall from Sowell's second-floor balcony into the garden a week before the grisly find, but the cops did nothing. 6 rotting female corpses were discovered inside the house, with 5 more buried in the garden. The Fornerets Manor, France. While Michel Fourneret was in prison, he and Monique Olivier had formed a morbid alliance through their correspondence. After he was set free, they began committing rapes and murders in this manner. Monique would reassure the little girls by being present, while Michel raped and murdered them. They committed their acts in a manor they bought on the French-Belgian border to avoid being discovered. Michel had become friends with a member of the gang of the Postiches during his time in prison. If Michel made contact with the inmate's wife and dug up the money, he'd get a cut of the gang's money. All of this was done by Fourneret. Instead of taking a portion of the money, he murdered the inmate's wife and stole the entire sum. Several bodies were discovered in the manor's garden. Great Deal US. A couple in Houston purchased a new home in 2017. After the previous occupant, Mary Cerruti, fled and stopped paying the mortgage in 2015, the house was said to have been vacant for 2 years. Since the construction of a real estate project in her neighborhood, she had been rarely seen outside the house. Short version of a long story. Dead cats were discovered inside the house during the investigation. The case was closed and the house was put up for sale because there was nothing else. When the new owners started working on the house, they discovered Cerruti's bones hidden within the walls. Her skeleton, too, displayed evidence of animal distress. The newlyweds who had just purchased the home did not spend the night there. When the discovery was made, it was a complete mystery. Was she murdered and stuffed into the wall, or did she become stuck inside the wall and die as a result? Cerruti had most likely fallen through a cracked attic floorboard and become trapped in the wall, officials said in March 2018. At least one of your neighbors isn't convinced. Cerruti's body could not have fallen through a fissure that was only slightly wider than a $1 bill, according to Roxanne Davis. London's Guru UK. Aravindan Balakrishnan, a 75-year-old Maoist leader, was arrested with his wife in 2013 after 2 cult members filed rape accusations with the police. He had been sexually abusing all of the followers of his women-only collective, which he had started 40 years ago, as the investigation would subsequently reveal. When detectives arrived at the Balakrishnan home, they discovered that the parents had been keeping their daughter in the cellar for 30 years. The young woman had been abused since she was 4 years old, according to her father, to exorcise her fascist tendencies. She was spanked with a pair of slippers or a McDonald's balloon stick that, Comrade Bala, had preserved specifically for this reason. She never saw her extended family, never developed friends, and never went to school or to the doctor. She was so lonely as a child that she talked to the toilet faucets and tried to befriend the rats and mice in her cellar. Joseph Fritzl, Austria. Joseph Fritzl put his daughter, Elizabeth, in chains and raped her in a small, and cute, family residence in Amstetten, Austria, beginning in 1984. Elizabeth had 7 miscarriages. One of the babies died soon after birth and was incinerated in the wood furnace. Joseph and his wife moved 3 of their children upstairs to live with them. Kristen, the eldest daughter, was admitted to the hospital after she became ill with kidney problems. Something was awry, according to the attending doctor, which sparked further attention in the initial disappearance. When Elizabeth arrived at the hospital, the police were called, and she was taken into custody and interrogated. She consented to testify on tape for her father's trial in 2008, and she did it bravely. She describes her life during the 24 years she was incarcerated in these tapes. Joseph had forced her to reenact obscene videos that he had forced her to view with him. Elizabeth would have died if she had tried to escape by the cellar door, which had been booby-trapped. To avoid traumatizing the jury, her 11-hour testimony had to be split up into short chunks. The Natasha Kampusch case, Austria. Wolfgang Prickloppel kidnapped Natasha Kampusch when she was 10 years old and raped her on a regular basis. In an underground cellar, she lived alone. On August 23, 2006, Kampusch, then 18 years old, attempted to escape and was discovered near Vienna. Prickloppel committed suicide by jumping under a train after the young woman escaped. Kampusch's eloquent statement focused light on the living conditions and sentiments of guilt experienced by victims of protracted detentions. The story of Kampusch is also a good example of Stockholm Syndrome, which occurs when an abduction victim develops a bond with the kidnapper. Kampusch wept and threw herself over Wolfie's body at the mortuary after he died. She bought the property where she had been imprisoned in 2008 and still visits it on occasion to ensure that it is in good repair. Prickloppel appears to have a connection to her terror house now that she is dead. The Garrido House, U.S. J.C. Dugard, an 11-year-old girl who was walking to the school bus stop, was abducted by Philip and Nancy Garrido in 1991. She was held in a locked garden shed and raped on a regular basis by Philip. J.C. had 2 daughters and thus had to share her modest shed with them. Philip Garrido began acting insane in 2009. He wanted to create a church and needed money to do so. A woman at the local college's fundraising office decided to phone his parole officer while he was ranting. Garrido brought his wife, J.C., and her 2 daughters with him when he was summoned to visit his parole officer a few days later. J.C. was eventually removed from Philip Garrido and told the cops everything that had happened to her over the preceding 18 years. And it was worse than anything we could have imagined. Living in a garden shed while being subjected to psychological and physical abuse on a regular basis. J.C. was exposed to the darkest aspects of human nature, yet she persevered and was reunited with her family after being separated from them for her adolescent and young adult years. The Garridos were apprehended at the parole office that day. For the kidnapping and other crimes committed against J.C. Dugard, Philip Garrido was sentenced to 431 years in prison and Nancy Garrido was sentenced to 36 years in jail in 2011. Subscribe to the channel and like it. There are still many interesting stories ahead.